This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, a vibrant online learning community providing high-quality educational content, the opportunity to connect with peers, and an outlet for new ideas in the field of nonprofit fundraising research.
I think that people who want to work at community foundations really need to get in there and stress to the staff that you need to continue to find all of these donors to not only keep your mission alive, but the missions of all of these different organizations.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. This interview is part of the Career Curious series. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Jo Theodosopoulos, Manager of Prospect Development at the Minneapolis Foundation.
Hello, Jo. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here to talk about working at a community foundation. I think that's something people don't often think, that there are researchers there in community foundations too, even though you're giving away money.
Right.
But before we jump into that, I'd love it if you would share a little bit about how you got into prospect research. How'd you land in this career?
Well, it's a pretty much common story, sort of fell into it. I was actually at a community foundation in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for 5 years doing donor relations and fundraising and pretty much everything. And I decided that it was time to look for something different. And a new organization opened up called the Edith Sanford Breast Cancer Foundation because T. Denny Sanford gave $100 million to the Sanford Health Foundation to start this new organization to focus on breast cancer research. And they had posted a job for a prospect research analyst. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, this sounds really interesting. I had no idea what it was at all. But then when I got to the part where it said that preference would be given to those who had an MLS, I perked up because I have one and never had a quote unquote library job. So I applied for it without knowing what I was getting into really. And I was lucky enough that I worked there for about just over a year and a half. And they basically paid me to learn how to be a prospect researcher. So I started the program there. And then there were some changes in the way that the organization was set up, and the overall Sanford Health Foundation sort of, I'm going to say, swallowed up the Edith Sanford Breast Cancer Foundation. And there was an instantaneous sort of culture shift. It was almost, you could almost feel it in the air. And I thought, maybe it's time for something else. And I've wanted to live in Minnesota for 20 years, but never really had the right stepping stones to get there. And I started looking at jobs, and I saw that there was a prospect research job at a community foundation. And I thought, this is perfect. I can go back to my roots and still do prospect research and help a community foundation grow in a different way than community foundations normally do. So I jumped on it, and I submitted my resume after the closing date because I hadn't seen it in time. So I submitted my resume at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, and the HR person called me at 8:15 on Monday morning.
That's really exciting that you not only wanted to move geographic locations, but you also could use then your new prospect research skills that they paid you to learn to do that. That's fantastic. Fantastic. And you sort of mentioned going back to your roots, helping a community foundation in a way that they don't typically grow. Can you tell us a little more about that? So what do you do at a community foundation? How do you do prospect research for them?
I always tell people the research itself isn't really all that different. The difference is that, there aren't a lot of full-time prospect researchers at community foundations, if any. I've sort of put that question out there, and no one has ever really raised their hand and said, oh yeah, I do prospect research full-time at a community foundation. Other than Creedy Gill in Vancouver, she was at a community foundation for a while. The way that community foundations traditionally work is that they rely mostly on referrals from financial advisors. So when the Minneapolis Foundation did a feasibility study a few years back and wanted to, see what they could do, one of the first recommendations was, first of all, hire a vice president for advancement and then hire a prospect researcher. That's how I ended up where I am. The main difference is that community foundations don't really have a core constituency. We don't have alumni. We don't have grateful patients. We're really just looking for those with high net worth who are philanthropic. I mean, that sounds easy, right? But it's sort of a monster task. It's been a lot of trial and error, basically just looking for those people who may have certain wealth events or just philanthropic in general, but it's also, we're very geographically based. So we're not really looking for anyone outside of the Twin Cities metro area. So it makes it a little difficult, but exciting. And, every day is a new thing. Let's try this today.
So are you doing a lot of proactive research?
I would say it's about 50-50 because our philanthropic advisors, which, development officers basically, will get a referral from someone, or else they'll ask me for, a list of, for instance, smaller family foundations that maybe we could work on to have them roll over their family foundation into our foundation. Actually, we're getting a lot of traction on that lately because there are so many small family foundations that are on their second or third generation. And the second or third generation doesn't necessarily have the same interest in running it as the first generation did. They're sort of overwhelmed with all of the grant requests that they get. And so they figure that if they could transfer it to us and have us run it, it's totally worth the fees that we would charge them to do that. And then we actually have insight into all of these organizations and where they could be going and how they could be running it. So we're doing a lot of that too.
The costs are high to open a foundation.
Right. And
So
it ends up being a lot of work for them that they don't have time for, or just don't have the skill set for.
So let's just jump right into the tension piece, because if you are, prospecting for high net worth, and you're limited in geographic area, are you directly competing with other nonprofits? Like, how do you balance that?
I don't really see it as competition because in the end, we're giving this money back to those other nonprofits as well. In fact, I actually think that more nonprofits are looking to us because we have, this huge pool of people who are actively giving their money away. Because we hear a lot about, how people with donor advised funds, particularly at commercial organizations, they're just putting that money away and not giving it out. But we actively pursue our donors and work with them to make sure that there's money going out just as much as there's money coming in. I went to a conference in town that was talking all about small family foundations and which ones are granting out to various causes in the Twin Cities. And it was interesting because as soon as they learned that I was from the Minneapolis Foundation, they all wanted my card. And they couldn't understand why I was there. And I'm like, you're giving me information on prospects, basically. That's how I look at it. And of course, they all want our ear because we are the ones who have connections to these people who they know are giving money away. So I guess I don't really see it as tension. I see it more as opportunities to partner with people.
Well, it is interesting because your community foundation's mission is a nonprofit mission, as opposed to a Fidelity,
right?
For donor advised funds and things like that. And if you have an expertise in knowing your community, that is of great value.
Absolutely.
Which is, again, totally different from a for-profit bank. Great answer. And that was a tough question. I'm wondering if there are any data challenges that are unique to a community foundation, because we know, our field in prospect research is dominated a lot by higher education, and they just have reams of data to analyze. What does your data picture look like?
Oh boy. It's a challenge for sure, because it actually, looking back, it was the same at the other community foundation I worked at. We're not all that good yet at capturing all of the data that we could. And it honestly has been an uphill battle for the 3 years that I've been here, because some of the people feel that maybe their donors wouldn't want any of that information captured or analyzed or reported on. So it's, like I said, it's 3 years of trying to get people to put stuff in the database. I've made huge progress, I'll say that, but it's still a struggle just to get the data. But it's working. We'll see.
Good, because that sounds a lot like any smaller nonprofit.
Where there hasn't been research, getting that culture to change and shift is a challenge.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what's a typical day like for you?
The one thing that I will say is that my typical day is pretty laid back. We've got a really easygoing culture here. In fact, we have summer Fridays, so we get to leave at noon on Friday. But a typical day is, looking at any research requests that I might have and taking care of those, going through all sorts of news alerts to see, okay, because there are a lot of publicly traded companies in Minneapolis. And so it's a lot of looking for any sort of those wealth events. It feels like there have been a lot of business sales lately. Valspar, for instance, was the big one. I don't know that my day is any different than anybody else in the prospect development world. So I guess I don't know.
Do you think you spend more time looking at community news?
And community or local events like wealth events, society pages?
I think maybe so, because like I said before, we don't really have a built-in constituency. So we are always looking at people who might have some sort of event that would make them look at a community foundation or a donor advised fund or, a scholarship fund, anything like that.
What happens once you identify someone?
Let's say you see a news article in the Business Journal. You're like, oh, wow, this is a new person on the scene. We probably ought to make friends with them. What happens next?
So the first thing that I would do is, if they are already a prospect, then I would see who is assigned to them as, their philanthropic advisor for pursuing them. If they don't have one, the way that our portfolios are set up is that they're set up by industry or particular, like for instance, we've got one person who focuses strictly on converting family foundations. We've got one person we call them swim lanes. One person whose swim lane is CEOs and ultra high net worth people. We've got one person whose main focus is multi-generational philanthropy. So as soon as I would identify where that fit in as far as the swim lane, I would just immediately send that over to the philanthropic advisor. And then I would work on, using RelSci to see if we know anyone who knows them, or talking to our CEO who just happens to be the former mayor of Minneapolis and knows all sorts of people, and all sorts of people know him and want to know him. So talking to him to see if perhaps he knows them in some fashion. And then just kind of going from there, trying to see what those inroads are.
And then do you have a prospect management system that kind of tracks what happens?
So once the prospect is assigned, do you help keep them moving through the cycle?
I actually am lucky enough that I don't have to worry about that. Our SVP actually takes care of all of the prospect management stuff. So once it's out of my plate, I move on to the next.
Talk about high priority. Senior VP is the one in charge. That's fantastic.
Yeah. It's I think that I must have been born under some lucky star, because I've always had I feel like I always have had a seat at the table here and at my previous jobs as well. So yeah, I call it luck. Maybe I should actually chalk it up to skill, but
it's probably a little of both, right? I'd say that 8:15 call was an indicator that you were a well-prepared candidate.
Well, I think it was, 5 years in a community foundation and prospect development. That's a match you don't find very often, I don't think.
No, I think you're right. That's very unusual. So I'm kind of curious. I saw APRA on your LinkedIn profile. How has APRA figured into your career?
APRA has been huge in my career. From the first day that I got hired at the Edith Stanford Breast Cancer Foundation, my boss was really a proponent of APRA and had me immediately call first of all, Michael Quevley from Target Analytics, and then he introduced me to Margaret Williams at the University of South Dakota Foundation, and they taught me everything I know. And then when I moved, and I was sent to not the APRA International Conference, because that was after I was hired in 2012, but 3 days after I started my job, I flew out to Nashville to I think it was a relationship management symposium. It was sort of a whirlwind jump right into APRA. And then when I moved to Minnesota, I mean, obviously I'm a one-person shop, and the only way that I was going to meet my peers was to jump right into APRA Minnesota. So I waited about 6 months before I started volunteering, just so I could get my feet wet, in my job and, in moving to a new city, etc. And so first I negotiated prior to accepting the job here. I basically said, I'm going to the APRA International Conference every year. And they were good with that. So I was introduced, I think I met Bond Lammy at the APRA International Conference in Vegas in 2014. And she then virtually introduced me to Mark Egge, and he said, you should volunteer for the programming committee. So I met with Sarah Price and Pat Thompson and started volunteering for the programming committee. And then I'm like, well, I may as well run for the board. So I did. And then next year I'm taking over as the president of APRA Minnesota. So I have nothing but good things to say about APRA.
That's so exciting to hear. You met some key people that are really on the top of our field. That's
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's very powerful too for you as a new researcher.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the scheme of things, I haven't really been doing this all that long. I started in 2012. I'm just one of those people that if I'm going to do something, I'm going to jump in and do it. So that's kind of the approach that I've taken to this as well.
I've heard a number of people tell me that they negotiated their continuing education up front. And I do think that's a really smart thing to do, because that's when you have the leverage.
Absolutely.
If they want to, and they want a lifelong learner, but that's the time. Otherwise, afterwards, the honeymoon's over.
Right. Yeah. It just feels like any time that there's some sort of, like in 2008 when the market crashed, the very first thing that got cut out of everybody's budget was continuing education, to the point where when I was at the Community Foundation in Sioux Falls, we actually started an initiative to have a number of capacity building workshops, and we would only charge people $10 because we knew that no one was getting any sort of continuing education anymore.
So I'm curious, what do you like best about working at a community foundation? If you have the health foundation to compare it to, what are some of those comparison and contrasts that really push you into the community foundation camp?
Sure. When I was interviewing at the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation, the vice president said, we're not actually doing any of the work that these nonprofits do. You're not going to be, on the front lines helping people do, you're not going to be feeding the poor. You're not going to do this. And I said, what I think is important is keeping those organizations afloat, helping those organizations to not have to worry about raising money so that they're able to focus on the work. And I think that that's the thing that I love about community foundations, is that we are partnering with all of these great organizations to help them advance their missions and help them keep going, so that that person is getting a free meal, somebody is getting a great education, someone is registering to vote for the first time, and we're sort of the back office to move these organizations forward and help them tackle their missions.
So that was a
powerful passion point for you.
Yeah.
A big distinction between the two.
Yeah.
So wrapping up a little bit, what would you recommend if someone else has that kind of passion where, they're not as interested in all of the challenges of the front line, and they would prefer to be able to help organizations, especially at those moments now when they need it, especially some growth moments, investment, just like any other startup company. There's times when they need investment money, and that often does come from community foundations. What would you suggest to someone who would seek a position at a community foundation?
Oh, wow. I think that the one opportunity for those of us in the community foundation world, I think that the one opportunity that we really need to jump on is the world is changing and people want to be more involved in their philanthropy. And so that means that, they might not necessarily go to a community foundation. They may want to be involved just in those frontline organizations. I think that people who want to work at community foundations really need to get in there and stress to the staff that you need to continue to find all of these donors to not only keep your mission alive but the missions of all of these different organizations. Does that make sense?
Well, given that your senior vice president is so involved,
maybe if someone's looking, would it make sense for them to have an informational interview with a key person at a community foundation?
Oh, for sure. I think that we have a great opportunity to meet with these people, and because I think that a lot of community foundation staff don't realize the wealth of information that prospect development professionals could give them, not only with prospect and donors, but also other organizations that maybe aren't on our radar to grant to.
So where do these community foundation professionals hang out? Is there an association for them or meetings that people could go to?
Yeah, there is the COF, it's the Council on Foundations. It's cof.org. They have a big conference every year. I'm assuming that every state also has its own foundation group. We've got the Minnesota Council of Foundations. I think that's what it's called. So, all of those organizations have conferences just like APRA does. There's also, I believe that all of our staff has a membership to AFP as well. So it's just getting out there and networking and talking, and don't get hung up if you think that this person doesn't want to meet with you because you think that, they're just going to think that I want a grant or something. Just start knocking on doors, picking up phones.
great advice. Absolutely.
Well, I am so glad that I got to talk to you. I think community foundations are really critical to our communities, and they're a bit mysterious for a lot of us. And we are mysterious to them as well. So maybe it's time we started talking a little bit more.
Yeah. Break down the walls.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Jo, for sharing with all of us. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I hope to see you in Anaheim.
That was Jo Theodosopoulos, Manager of Prospect Development at the Minneapolis Foundation. To find chat bites and more prospect research resources, join us in the Resource Collections community at prospectresearchinstitute.org.